I never thought my life would be turned upside down by a metal box sitting behind my garage, but that's exactly what happened when Brenda Morrison decided my emergency generator was ruining her view of the perfectly manicured lawns of Riverside Meadows. My name is Jacob Emerson, and I've lived in this neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, Iowa for 8 years. I'm a software engineer who works from home, and I've always kept to myself, paid my dues on time, and followed every ridiculous rule the Homeowners Association threw at me. The grass height specifications, the approved mailbox colors, the restrictions on Christmas decorations, all of it. I was the model resident until last November when I made the mistake of trying to protect my home. The previous winter had been brutal. A massive ice storm knocked out power to our neighborhood for 3 days, and I watched my pipes nearly freeze while I huddled under blankets with my wife Emily and our 2 kids. The house dropped to 45 degrees inside, and we were lucky we didn't have burst pipes like several of our neighbors. I swore it wouldn't happen again, so when spring came, I saved up and bought a quality whole-house generator from a reputable company. Cost me nearly $9,000 with installation, but it was worth every penny for peace of mind. The installation crew came in May. I had them place it behind my garage, tucked away where it would be minimally visible from the street. It sat on a concrete pad, properly grounded, with all the necessary permits from the city. I'd done everything by the book. The generator was a Generac model, natural gas powered, designed to kick on automatically when the power went out. The installer assured me it met all sound ordinances and was positioned the required distance from property lines. For 6 months, nobody said a word. The generator sat there quietly, and I tested it once a month as recommended. Everything was perfect until October rolled around and Brenda Morrison apparently remembered she had nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. I found it tucked into my front door, an official-looking envelope with the Riverside Meadows HOA logo stamped on it. Inside was a 2-page notice informing me that my generator violated Section 14, Paragraph 7 of the HOA covenants, which stated that no mechanical equipment shall be visible from neighboring properties without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I read it twice, then walked outside to look at my generator. You could barely see the thing unless you stood in a very specific spot in Brenda's backyard and craned your neck. From the street, it was completely invisible. From my other neighbors' yards, blocked by my garage and fence. But Brenda lived directly behind me, and apparently, if she stood on her back deck and looked hard enough, she could see about 8 inches of the top of my generator. I called the HOA office the next morning. The property manager, a tired-sounding woman named Patricia, listened to my complaint and sighed. "Mr. Emerson, I understand your frustration, but Mrs. Morrison filed a formal complaint. The board has to address it. The generator is legal. I have city permits." "It's a safety device," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That may be, but the HOA covenants are separate from city regulations. You'll need to submit a request for architectural approval retroactively, or you'll need to relocate or remove the generator." "Relocate it where?" "There's nowhere else to put it that would work. It needs to be near the gas line and the electrical panel." Patricia sighed again. "I'm just telling you what the board decided. You can appeal at the next meeting if you'd like." I hung up and immediately started drafting my appeal. I gathered my permits, photos showing how minimally visible the generator was, documentation about the safety benefits, and even got letters from my other neighbors saying they had no problem with it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for November 15th, which gave me 2 weeks to prepare. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable folding chairs. About 15 residents showed up, most of them there for other business. The board consisted of 5 people. Brenda Morrison as president, 2 men I vaguely recognized named Frank and Harold, and 2 women named Susan and Margaret. Brenda sat at the center of the table, looking exactly like you'd expect. She was 53 with a blonde bob that looked like it got touched up weekly, wearing a cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She had that particular expression of someone who derives genuine pleasure from enforcing rules. Item 7 on the agenda, Brenda announced, looking directly at me. The unauthorized generator at 2847 Maple Drive. I stood up, folder in hand. I'd like to present my appeal. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Emerson. I laid out my case. The safety concerns from the previous winter. The city permits. The minimal visibility. The letters from neighbors. I showed photos demonstrating that you could only see a tiny portion of the generator from one very specific angle. I explained that relocating it wasn't feasible without spending thousands more and potentially creating actual code violations. Brenda listened with her arms crossed. When I finished, she didn't even pause. Mr. Emerson, the covenants are very clear. Mechanical equipment must not be visible without approval. You installed this generator without seeking approval. That's a violation, regardless of city permits. But it's a safety device, I said. Surely there's room for common sense here. The rules apply equally to everyone, Brenda said. If we make exceptions, the whole system falls apart. Frank, one of the board members, cleared his throat. I have a generator too, Brenda. Had it for years. If we're going to enforce this, shouldn't we be consistent? Brenda's expression tightened. Your generator was approved 15 years ago, Frank. Completely different situation. It's the same model as mine, Frank said, and it's more visible. The board approved it, Brenda snapped. That's the difference. Mr. Emerson chose to bypass the proper channels. I didn't know there were channels, I said. The installer pulled all the necessary permits. I assumed that covered it. Ignorance of the covenants isn't an excuse. You signed them when you bought your property. Brenda shuffled her papers. The board will vote. All in favor of requiring Mr. Emerson to remove or relocate his generator. Brenda raised her hand immediately. Susan and Margaret followed suit after a moment's hesitation. Harold abstained. Frank voted against. Motion carries 3-1 with 1 abstention. Mr. Emerson, you have 30 days to comply. I left that meeting furious. Emily tried to calm me down when I got home, but I was beyond reason. I'd spent $9,000 on a legitimate safety device, followed all the actual legal requirements, and now I was being told to rip it out or spend thousands more to relocate it, because Brenda Morrison didn't like seeing a sliver of metal from her back deck. Over the next week, I explored my options. I called 3 different contractors about relocation costs. The cheapest quote was $6,000, and that involved running new gas lines and electrical connections in a way that might not even work with my house's layout. The other quotes were even higher. Removing it entirely meant eating the $9,000 I'd already spent, plus I'd have no backup power. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. She looked over my covenants and shook her head. Unfortunately, Mr. Emerson, they're technically within their rights. The language is broad enough to cover your generator. You could fight it in court, but that would cost you $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'd win. So I'm just screwed. You have a few options. You could comply with their order. You could try to get elected to the board and change the rules. Or, she paused, you could look for creative ways to work within the system. That last comment stuck with me. work within the system. I went home and read through the entire HOA covenant document that night, all 73 pages of rules and regulations. And that's when I found something interesting. Section 14, Paragraph 7 prohibited visible mechanical equipment without approval. But Section 22, Paragraph 3 explicitly stated that the HOA was responsible for maintaining all common areas and ensuring that shared infrastructure was in working order. Section 22, Paragraph 9 went further, stating that in cases of emergency or infrastructure failure, the HOA must take immediate and appropriate action to protect property values and resident safety. I also found something else. My property deed, which I dug out of my filing cabinet, showed that the transformer serving my house and 3 others actually sat on a utility easement that ran through HOA common property. And my generator, while on my property, had a natural gas connection that tied into a line running through that same easement. An idea started forming. A petty, vindictive, absolutely perfect idea. I spent the next week doing research. I checked weather forecasts and climatology data. I studied utility easement law. I reviewed every single word of the HOA covenants, looking for loopholes and leverage. And I made some calls to the utility company, asking very specific questions about how power distribution worked in our neighborhood. What I learned was this. Our neighborhood was on an older grid section that was prone to outages during severe weather. The transformer serving my block was 30 years old and had failed twice in the last decade. During major winter storms, our area was often one of the last to get power restored because we were at the end of a service line. The weather forecast for late December and early January was looking ominous. Multiple meteorologists were predicting an Arctic blast that could bring record-breaking cold to Iowa. Temperatures potentially dropping to -20 or worse, sustained over several days. Exactly the kind of weather that knocked out power. I made my decision. If the HOA wanted to play hardball about safety equipment, I'd let them see exactly why that equipment mattered. On December 20th, I called a contractor. Not to relocate my generator, but to disconnect it. The guy looked at me like I was crazy. You want me to disconnect your whole house generator right before a major cold snap? That's correct. I need to comply with my HOA's orders. But you could reconnect it later after. I need it disconnected now, fully. I want documentation showing it's non-operational. He shrugged and did the work. Cost me $400 to have him disconnect the natural gas line, disconnect the electrical connections, and provide me with a detailed invoice and photos showing the generator was completely non-functional. I sent copies to the HOA office, along with a letter stating I was in compliance with their order. Brenda Morrison sent back a response 3 days later saying the generator still needed to be physically removed from the property. I replied that I was in the process of arranging removal, but wanted to ensure it was properly disconnected first for safety reasons, and that I'd have it removed in early February after I'd secured the funds for disposal. The deep freeze started on December 27th. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees, then 5, then 0. Weather reports showed the Arctic front settling in for an extended stay. By December 29th, we were at -8 degrees, and the wind chill was -30. My house stayed warm. I'd prepared for this. Before disconnecting the generator, I'd bought 6 space heaters, extra blankets, and a small portable propane heater that was safe for indoor use. I'd also bought a camping stove for cooking. If the power went out, we'd be uncomfortable, but we'd be okay. The power went out at 2 in the morning on December 30th. I woke up to the complete silence that comes when every electrical hum in your house suddenly stops. No furnace, no refrigerator, no lights. Outside, the temperature was negative 15 degrees. I got up and looked out my front window. The entire neighborhood was dark. The street lights were out. Every house was black. I felt a moment of guilt, then remembered Brenda's smug face at that meeting and the guilt evaporated. I set up our space heaters in the bedrooms and living room, running them off the power from my car using an inverter I'd bought. It was a hassle, but it worked well enough to keep the main living areas in the low 60s. Not comfortable, but survivable. The power stayed out all day. By afternoon, I started seeing neighbors outside, confused and cold. The temperature had dropped to negative 18. Most people in the neighborhood had left for work or to stay with family, but quite a few had stayed home because of the holiday week. I got a knock on my door around 3 in the afternoon. It was Frank from the HOA board, wrapped in 3 coats. "Jacob, I know you disconnected your generator, but do you have any way to power it back up, even temporarily? My wife has medical equipment that needs power." I shook my head. I had it fully disconnected to comply with the HOA order. It would take a contractor to reconnect it, and nobody's coming out in this weather. Frank's face fell. "We're trying to get a hotel, but everything's booked because of the storm. Try calling Linda Fletcher 2 streets over. She has solar panels with battery backup. She might be able to help with the medical equipment." Frank nodded and hurried off. I felt bad about his situation, but it wasn't my fault. The HOA had forced my hand. By the evening of the 31st, the temperature had dropped to negative 22 degrees. The power was still out. I heard later that the transformer serving our neighborhood had failed catastrophically, and the utility company was struggling to get repair crews out to all the affected areas. Our neighborhood wasn't a priority because it was residential, and there were hospitals and critical infrastructure that needed attention first. That's when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Emerson, this is Brenda Morrison." I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, Brenda. I'm calling to see if you might reconsider reconnecting your generator temporarily. This is an emergency situation, and several residents are in distress." I'd love to help, but as I informed the HOA, the generator has been fully disconnected to comply with your orders. It's not operational. Surely you could have it reconnected. This is a matter of safety. It would require a licensed contractor to reconnect the gas and electrical lines safely. I've called several, and none are available for at least 3 to 5 days given the weather and demand. There was a long pause. "Mr. Emerson, I understand you're angry about the board's decision, but people are suffering. My own house is down to 50 degrees. I'm very sorry to hear that. Perhaps the HOA should have considered the safety implications before ordering me to disable my backup power. Are you seriously going to let people freeze over a petty dispute? I'm not letting anyone do anything. I complied with your order. What's happening now is a consequence of that order." Brenda's voice went cold. "I could have the board fine you for refusing to help in an emergency. Feel free to try. I've broken no rules. In fact, I'm in full compliance with your demands. Have a good evening, Brenda." I hung up. Emily looked at me with concern. Was that smart? "She's going to make this worse for you. She already made it as bad as she could. I'm not going to be bullied." The power stayed out all through New Year's Day. The temperature remained below negative 15. I heard through neighborhood social media that several families had evacuated to hotels or family members' houses. The roads were dangerous but passable if you were desperate enough. More people knocked on my door. I gave them the same answer. The generator was disconnected per HOA orders, and I couldn't safely reconnect it in these conditions even if I wanted to. Some people were understanding. Others were angry, but their anger was misplaced, and I told them so. On January 2nd, the power came back on briefly, then failed again after 3 hours. The utility company said the replacement transformer was struggling under the load in the extreme cold. They were working on a permanent fix, but it would take time. That evening, I got another call. This time, it was Patricia from the HOA management company. "Mr. Emerson, I've been authorized by the board to offer you a deal. If you can get your generator operational and agree to share power with affected neighbors, the board will withdraw the violation notice and approve your generator placement retroactively." That's generous, but as I've explained, the generator can't be safely reconnected without a contractor, and none are available. The board is willing to pay for an emergency contractor if you can find one. I've called everyone in the area. Nobody's coming out for at least a week. Patricia sighed. "Is there anything that would motivate you to try harder? Maybe if the board had thought about emergency situations before they decided a sliver of visible metal was more important than resident safety." "Mr. Emerson, I understand you feel wronged, but I don't feel wronged. I was wronged. The board made a decision, I complied with it, and now we're all living with the consequences. That's how rules work." I hung up again. I wasn't enjoying people's suffering, but I also wasn't going to let them pretend this was my fault. They'd created this situation. Every bit of it. The next day, January 3rd, brought a new development. Someone had apparently called the local news. A reporter from KCRG TV 9 showed up at my door with a cameraman. "Mr. Emerson, I'm Jennifer Walsh with Channel 9. We're doing a story on the power outages, and we heard you have a non-functioning backup generator. Can you comment?" I considered sending her away, then decided this might be exactly the opportunity I needed. "I'd be happy to talk. Come in out of the cold." We sat in my living room, where I'd managed to get the temperature up to 68 degrees using a combination of space heaters and the propane heater. The contrast with outside, where it was -12, was stark. Jennifer asked her questions and I answered honestly. I explained the whole situation. How I'd installed a legal generator with proper permits. How the HOA had ordered me to remove it over a visibility complaint. How I disconnected it to comply with their orders. How that decision had left not just me but my neighbors without backup power during the worst cold snap in decades. "You feel responsible for your neighbor's situation?" Jennifer asked. "I feel bad that people are suffering, but I'm not responsible. I tried to do the right thing by installing emergency backup power. The HOA decided that violating their aesthetic rules was more important than safety. I complied with their decision. What's happening now is the logical outcome of that decision. Some of your neighbors are calling you selfish. They're welcome to their opinion. I'd encourage them to direct their concerns to the HOA board that created this situation." The interview aired that evening. I watched it with Emily and the kids, who were blissfully unaware of the drama and just happy to be warm. The news segment included interviews with shivering neighbors, shots of the disabled generator, and Brenda Morrison defending the HOA's decision. She looked terrible on camera, defensive and bureaucratic, insisting that rules were rules while standing in a house that was clearly freezing. The comments section on the news station's website exploded. Hundreds of people weighing in, and the vast majority were on my side. People calling the HOA ridiculous, bureaucratic nightmares, petty tyrants. Several people shared their own HOA horror stories. A few called me an ass for not helping my neighbors, but they were drowned out by the support. The temperature finally started to rise on January 4th. It climbed all the way up to 0 degrees, which felt tropical by comparison. The power came back on that evening and miraculously stayed on. The utility company had installed a new transformer and reinforced the lines. I thought that might be the end of it. The crisis was over, everyone could heat their homes again, and maybe the HOA would quietly drop the whole generator issue. I was wrong. On January 6th, I received a new letter from the HOA. This one informed me that I was being fined $5,000 for failure to maintain property in a manner consistent with community standards and failure to assist in an emergency situation, as required by Section 22, Paragraph 9. I read the letter 3 times, then called the lawyer I'd consulted before. "They're fining me for complying with their order," I asked after explaining the situation. "They're trying to have it both ways," she said. "They're claiming you had a duty to maintain emergency preparedness equipment and that disabling your generator violated that duty. But they ordered me to disable it, I know. That's what makes this interesting. They've created a paradox. They ordered you to remove equipment you complied, and now they're punishing you for complying. That's not going to hold up. So what do? You could pay the fine and fight it in arbitration. Or," she paused and I could hear the smile in her voice, "or we could go nuclear." "I'm listening." "Your situation has gotten media attention. That means we have leverage. I suggest we file a lawsuit against the HOA for creating a dangerous situation through arbitrary and capricious enforcement of rules. We'll argue that their actions directly contributed to your neighbors suffering during the cold snap, and we'll seek damages for your costs, emotional distress, and legal fees. Can we win?" "After the news coverage. With documentation showing you tried to do the right thing and they forced you to disable safety equipment." "Absolutely. And even if we don't win, the publicity will destroy them. Most HOAs are terrified of bad press because it affects property values. Let's do it." She drew up the lawsuit, and we filed it on January 10th. The local news picked up the story immediately. So did the Des Moines Register and several national outlets that loved HOA horror stories. Suddenly, Riverside Meadows and Brenda Morrison were famous for all the wrong reasons. The HOA held an emergency meeting on January 13th. I wasn't invited, but Frank called me afterward. "Jacob, it's chaos. Half the neighborhood wants Brenda removed from the board. The other half thinks you're a monster. The management company is freaking out because property values are dropping just from the bad publicity." "Good," I said, and I meant it. "Brenda's refusing to back down. She's convinced she was right and that you're just a troublemaker. What do the other board members think?" "Harold and I want to settle this. Susan and Margaret are loyal to Brenda. It's a mess." The lawsuit moved forward. Discovery was a beautiful thing. We subpoenaed all the HOA's records, including every architectural approval request for the past 20 years. What we found was stunning. Brenda Morrison had approved her own pool installation without the required setback from the property line. Frank's generator, which he'd mentioned, had been approved despite being more visible than mine. Harold had a shed that violated height restrictions. Susan had installed a deck that didn't match the approved plans. Margaret had a satellite dish that was explicitly prohibited by the covenants. Everyone on the board had violated something, and everyone had gotten exceptions. Everyone except me. My lawyer submitted all of this in our filings, arguing selective enforcement and discrimination. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that each case was different, but the evidence was damning. They'd enforced rules arbitrarily based on personal preferences, and they'd used their power to punish someone they didn't like while giving themselves and their friends a pass. The case was scheduled for arbitration in March, but it never got that far. On February 20th, I received a settlement offer. The HOA would drop all fines and violations against me, approve my generator placement retroactively, pay my legal fees of $8,000 and issue a written apology. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit, I countered. I wanted the approval, the legal fees, the apology, and I wanted Brenda Morrison removed from the board. I also wanted the HOA to establish clear, written standards for architectural approvals, so this couldn't happen to anyone else. They accepted after 2 weeks of negotiation. Brenda fought it, but the other board members and the management company overruled her. The alternative was going to arbitration, where everything would become public record, and they'd almost certainly lose worse. On March 15th, I received a formal letter from the Riverside Meadows HOA Board of Directors. It stated that my generator installation was approved, all previous violations were rescinded, and they were enclosing a check for $8,000. Attached was a signed apology from the board acknowledging that their enforcement had been inconsistent with community standards, and that they would strive to apply rules fairly and consistently in the future. Brenda Morrison resigned from the board effective immediately. She tried to spin it as a voluntary decision to spend more time with family, but everyone knew the truth. She'd been forced out because her petty tyranny had cost the HOA thousands in legal fees and damaged the community's reputation. Frank was elected president in her place. One of his first acts was to form a committee to revise the architectural approval process, and he asked me to serve on it. I declined. I'd spent enough time dealing with HOA politics. The generator sat behind my garage, fully operational and officially approved. I tested it monthly, and every time I heard that engine rumble to life, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Life in Riverside Meadows slowly returned to normal. People stopped bringing up the freeze whenever they saw me. Most of my neighbors realized I hadn't been the villain in the story. A few still gave me dirty looks, but I didn't care. I'd stood my ground and won. Emily and I talked about moving after everything that happened. We looked at houses in neighborhoods without HOAs, but in the end, we decided to stay. The house was perfect for our family, and with Brenda gone and reforms in place, the HOA was actually becoming reasonable. That next winter was mild, and we never lost power. But in February, an ice storm hit and knocked out electricity to a different neighborhood in Cedar Rapids. I read about it in the news and felt a moment of gratitude for my generator. Several people in that neighborhood ended up with burst pipes and flooded basements. I also noticed something interesting. Applications for generator installations in Riverside Meadows increased dramatically after our incident. At least 8 of my neighbors installed backup power systems over the next year. The HOA approved every single one with minimal fuss, having learned their lesson about interfering with legitimate safety equipment. Frank called me in April to let me know that someone had filed a complaint about my generator being too loud when it ran its monthly test. He'd rejected the complaint immediately, citing the new standards that explicitly allowed generators as long as they met city noise ordinances, which mine did. Who complained? I asked. Guess. Brenda. She still lives in the neighborhood, still bitter about the whole thing. Tell her to pound sand. Already did, in slightly more professional language. I ran into Brenda once that summer at the grocery store. She saw me, turned around, and walked the other direction. I considered following her to gloat, but decided I'd won enough already. No point being petty about it. The news story had unexpected consequences. I started getting emails from people across the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. Some wanted advice, some just wanted to vent. A few lawyers reached out asking if I'd be willing to consult on other cases involving HOA overreach. I declined most of them, but I did help a guy in Minnesota who was fighting his HOA over a solar panel installation. I connected him with my lawyer and shared our legal strategy. He ended up winning his case, and his HOA had to pay him $15,000 in damages. That fall, I was interviewed for a podcast about HOA reform. The host was a real estate attorney who had made it her mission to help homeowners fight back against abusive associations. We talked for 2 hours about my experience, and the episode got thousands of downloads. What would you say to someone who's dealing with a situation like yours? The host asked toward the end. Document everything. Follow the rules exactly as written, not as you think they should be. And don't be afraid to stand your ground when the HOA is clearly wrong. These organizations only have the power we give them. Any regrets about how you handled it? I thought about that for a moment. No, I tried to do the right thing from the start. They forced the confrontation. If I had to do it again, I'd make the same choices. The podcast episode led to an article in a national real estate magazine about HOA reform and the growing backlash against restrictive covenants. I was quoted extensively, and several lawyers cited our case as an example of successful pushback against arbitrary rule enforcement. Property values in Riverside Meadows, which had dipped slightly during the controversy, recovered fully within 6 months. The new board's more reasonable approach to governance actually made the neighborhood more attractive to buyers. People wanted to live somewhere with standards, but they didn't want to live under a dictatorship. I kept every document from the whole ordeal in a file in my office. The violation notices, the legal filings, the settlement agreement, the apology letter. Sometimes I'd take them out and read through them, remembering how angry and helpless I'd felt when Brenda first tried to force me to remove my generator. Emily asked me once if I felt bad about how hard I'd pushed back. People were cold and scared because of what you did, she said. Some of them were your friends. People were cold and scared because of what the HOA did, I corrected. I gave them an out, multiple times. They chose to double down. That's on them. But you could have tried harder to fix the generator. I could have spent thousands more dollars to fix a problem the HOA created. No, sometimes people need to experience the consequences of their decisions. The board made a choice that prioritized aesthetics over safety. They needed to understand what that really meant. She nodded slowly. I guess you're right. I just worry about what the neighbors think. The neighbors who matter understand what happened. The ones who don't weren't really our friends anyway. As I write this, it's been over a year since the deep freeze. My generator sits behind my garage, clean and well-maintained, ready to kick on whenever the power fails. The HOA approval notice is filed away with my property documents. Brenda Morrison still lives in the neighborhood but keeps to herself. Frank runs the board with actual competence and fairness. I learned some valuable lessons from the whole experience. The first is that being right isn't enough. You have to be willing to fight for it, and that fight can get ugly. The second is that bureaucratic bullies only understand one language, and that's consequences. You can't reason with someone like Brenda Morrison. You can only make them face the reality of their decisions. The third lesson is that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I could have backed down, relocated my generator, eaten the cost, and avoided all the drama. But then what? The HOA would have learned they could push people around without consequence. Brenda would still be running the board, making arbitrary decisions and ruining people's lives over petty complaints. Instead, I fought back. I won. And the neighborhood is better for it. People sometimes ask me if I think I overreacted. If maybe I should have been more accommodating, more willing to compromise. My answer is always the same. I tried to compromise. I offered solutions. They refused. At that point, it stopped being about the generator and started being about principle. The generator itself is almost beside the point now. It's a symbol, a metal box that represents the fundamental question of what HOAs are supposed to be. Are they meant to protect property values and community standards? Or are they tools for petty tyrants to exercise power over their neighbors? In Riverside Meadows, we answered that question. The HOA exists to serve the community, not the other way around. Rules matter, but they have to be applied fairly and with common sense. Safety comes before aesthetics, and boards need to be accountable for their decisions. I still attend HOA meetings occasionally, just to keep tabs on what's happening. Frank runs them efficiently, without the theatrical nonsense Brenda favored. Discussions are civil. Decisions are documented and explained. When someone requests an architectural approval, they get a clear answer with written reasoning. It's amazing what competent leadership can accomplish. My generator has activated 3 times since the deep freeze. Once during a summer thunderstorm that knocked out power for 6 hours. Once during a brief outage from a car hitting a utility pole. And once during planned maintenance by the power company. Each time it kicked on automatically, kept my house running smoothly, and shut down when grid power returned. Exactly as designed. Exactly why I'd installed it in the first place. Several of my neighbors have commented that hearing my generator run during outages gives them a sense of security. They know at least one house on the block has power, which means phones can be charged, medical equipment can run, and there's somewhere to go if things get really bad. The generator isn't just protecting my family anymore. It's a resource for the whole block. That's what safety equipment does. It helps people. The fact that the HOA tried to eliminate it over aesthetics shows how warped their priorities were. I think about that sometimes when I'm out walking the neighborhood. All these perfect lawns, approved mailboxes, and conforming paint colors. It looks nice. It's pleasant. But underneath all that carefully maintained appearance, there are real people dealing with real problems. And when those problems collide with HOA rules, the rules need to bend. That's what our case established. A precedent, both legally and culturally. The board can't just do whatever they want anymore. They have to think about consequences. They have to consider whether their enforcement actually serves the community's interests. Brenda Morrison never understood that. She thought being president of an HOA board meant she got to run things according to her personal preferences. She saw rules as weapons to use against people she didn't like. And when someone finally stood up to her, her entire worldview collapsed. I don't feel sorry for her. She had multiple opportunities to back down, to compromise, to be reasonable. She chose to escalate at every turn. The settlement cost the HOA over $20,000 when you include legal fees and my damages. That money came from everyone's HOA dues. Brenda's stubbornness cost every homeowner in the neighborhood money. That's why they forced her out. Not because they suddenly developed principles, but because she became a liability. The other board members realized they were going to lose, that fighting me was going to cost more than just admitting they'd screwed up. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd backed down initially. If I just paid to relocate the generator or removed it entirely. I'd be out thousands of dollars, and my family would be vulnerable during power outages. The HOA would have learned nothing, and Brenda would still be terrorizing people over trivial violations. Instead, she's powerless. The board is functional, my generator is approved, and my family is safe, worth it. The legal system worked eventually. It took time and money and stress, but justice prevailed. The HOA tried to use their authority arbitrarily, and they got slapped down for it. The settlement we reached established clear guidelines that will protect other homeowners from similar abuse. That's the real victory. Not just that I won my specific case, but that we created precedent. The next person who wants to install a generator or solar panels or any other legitimate improvement won't have to fight the same battle. The rules are clearer now. The process is fairer. Emily jokes that I should run for the HOA board myself. Make sure the reforms stick. I've considered it, but ultimately decided I've spent enough time on HOA politics. Let Frank and the new board handle it. They're doing fine. I'll stay engaged enough to make sure they don't backslide, but I'm not interested in the day-to-day governance. I've got better things to do with my time. Like enjoying my home, raising my kids, and knowing that if the power goes out again, my generator will keep us safe and warm. That's what this was always about. Safety, security, protecting my family. The HOA tried to take that away over nothing, and I made sure they couldn't. Looking back on the whole saga, from that first violation notice to the final settlement, I'm proud of how I handled it. I didn't back down. I didn't get intimidated. I fought smart, documented everything, and used their own rules against them, and I won. The generator behind my garage hums quietly during its monthly test, a reminder that sometimes the only way to deal with an unreasonable authority is to let them experience the consequences of their own decisions. Brenda Morrison wanted to enforce rules without considering their impact. I let her do exactly that, and she destroyed herself in the process. That's not petty revenge. That's accountability. My advice to anyone dealing with an abusive HOA is simple. Know your rights, document everything, and don't be afraid to fight back. These organizations depend on homeowners being too tired or too intimidated to challenge them. Once you prove you're willing to stand your ground, they usually fold, and if they don't fold, make them pay. Literally. Hit them where it hurts, which is their wallet and their reputation. Bad publicity is poison to an HOA because it affects property values, and property values are the one thing they actually care about. The week-long freeze was terrible for a lot of people. I don't minimize that. Families were cold, uncomfortable, and scared. But that wasn't my fault. I tried to prevent exactly that situation by installing backup power. The HOA stopped me. When the crisis came, they expected me to magically fix the problem they'd created. I declined, and that decision forced them to reckon with their choices. Sometimes the only way to teach someone a lesson is to let them fail. The board failed spectacularly during that freeze, and everyone saw it. They couldn't hide behind bureaucratic justifications when people were shivering in their homes. The emperor had no clothes, and I'd stripped them off. I sleep well at night knowing my generator is ready if we ever face another deep freeze. I sleep even better knowing the HOA can't take that security away from me again. We fought that battle once, and I won decisively. The metal box behind my garage represents more than backup power now. It represents the principle that homeowners have rights, that HOAs have limits, and that standing up to bullies is worth the fight. Brenda Morrison learned that the hard way. The rest of the neighborhood learned it too, and Riverside Meadows is better for it. My generator is staying right where it is, approved and protected, keeping my family safe no matter what the weather throws at us. That's all I ever wanted, and it's what I fought for. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat.